second to pull the. There we go. You'll switch the. To be able to pull it up, so you just use your.
So
You just use the mic.
Okay,
and
I was
then
just
here.
going to say hello
Yeah.
to our folks.
Go ahead.
All right, just 1 second here, and then we'll get started with our Q&A as we get to take. That was a fantastic film. I hope that you all really enjoyed it as much as I did. It's my second time getting a chance to see it through. It's just as good, if not better, the second time through than it was the first. Okay, so now is the point that you've been waiting for, and that is the dialogue and the talk back with our truth tellers. And I don't know if you can see, it's a little dark in the cinema, but I'm Brandon McCormick, a professor of Pan-African Studies and Comparative Humanities at the University of Louisville and director of the Ann Braden Institute for Social Justice Research. And we are just so honored and thankful to have you all with us this afternoon to share with our audience here in Louisville, Kentucky. So thank you so much for being here with us. I won't spend a lot of time. I told the folks up front that I won't talk to you long because people came to hear from you all. So I just want to introduce the conversation a bit and then allow you all to talk. Please, the bios for each of our truth tellers are in your program, so I won't go through a lengthy reintroduction of them. You can read all of the bios there in your program, but please join me in welcoming our artist, Robert Shetterly, activist Bree Newsome Bass, and Maulian joining us today. So first of all, let me just say thank each of you for, I'm not sure where, I feel like I'm blocking your view, so I'm not sure, I got to figure out where to stand in the space so that you can see the folks. Thank each of you for your work, for your respective work as artists, as activists, as truth tellers. Thank you so much, Robert, for the work that you've done in painting these portraits of our truth tellers so that we could have these narratives, so that we could have these stories, so that we could begin to tell a different narrative about the country that we live in and what it might mean to strive towards a richer and fuller form of democracy. And thank you both, Bree and Maulian, for the work that you have done in racial justice and indigenous rights, activism, and environmental justice. We really, really appreciate your work. I'd just like to open by asking each of you, this is a brilliant film, and we really appreciated it here. What's the significance of this film to you all right now, seeing your work featured in a film like this at this particular moment in our country, in our history, with everything that's going on right now and the struggles that we're facing for racial and environmental justice? Just talk about the significance of this film being released at this moment and being able to see your work featured in a film like this. And I think each of you may be muted.
Yes, we are.
Okay.
There you go.
Who would you like to have talk first?
Well, you are pinned on our screen right now, and you are on the big screen, and it seems only appropriate and right to have you speak first, Mr. Shetterly.
Oh, thank you. It's so nice to meet you, and it's also an honor to be there in the speed, and also here with Bree and Maulian. It's just having the film done is and be the focus of it is kind of overwhelming. But in terms of where we are at this moment in our history and the importance that is so critical in paying attention to the voices and the actions of the people who I've painted as these portraits, whether it's about race or gender or particularly environment and climate, it's critical. And so the degree to which we can get this film shown to people and have them have dialogue about it, and then the next question will be for them, well, what could you be doing? And that's what we hope to have happen with this, that people see it, they understand the history behind it, and then they talk about what it could mean to them, and then what it means to be a more fully engaged citizen. And I don't know if there's been any time in our history when we've needed that more.
Thank you. Bree Newsome has unmuted, so.
Sure. Yeah, I can jump in. One of the parts of the film that I like the most is actually the interview with Reverend Yearwood, where he's talking, he raises the point about how there are all of these different issues, and sometimes people operate in silos around particular issues, but all of the issues are connected, and it requires everyone coming together, and it requires everyone identifying what they can do. And I love that, because I think it speaks to just the situation that we are in currently. I think that is the reality, right? All of these issues overlap. And I mean, even when you get to, the section with me where we're talking, the primary focus is on racism, but we know that racism overlaps with climate justice, right? We know that it overlaps with so many other issues, economic justice. And so I think that what I love about what Robert has done with this series, and as you even say, Robert, you did it in part as like a form of therapy for yourself to grapple with times, right? But it's powerful because it really, I think, makes clear for everyone, if you are looking at everything that's happening and you are trying to figure out for yourself, what can I do? You can draw inspiration from all of these different figures throughout history, from several different, movements and points in time, who exercised courage, who told the truth. And I think in that way, it illuminates for us how we get where we need to get. It always has been kind of like the mobilization of everyday people. And some of the things that you do, you may think that they are small, but you never know the amount of impact that you are having. And when you have everyone taking action in meaningful ways, that's what adds up to actual change. It's never just about one person or one moment. And that's what I love about the series, that it really highlights that. And I think it drives it home.
Yeah, very well said, Bree. I think something that was really special for me, being featured in this amazing movement, really, that you've created, Rob, in this film. A lot of us that have been painted have been told our whole lives that our truth is not valid, or doesn't matter, or isn't a truth at all. We've been told time and time again that our feelings are just that, they're just feelings. They're not connected to real life, history, and that we're supposed to be taught, the regular curriculums in school and things that really overshadow the experiences of our people. So to be told, you are truth tellers, and yes, it's valid. Yes, it's important. Yes, it's real. I think that's super empowering for a lot of voices that have been silenced and marginalized in this country. And as both of my panelists have said, my fellow panelists, that is so needed right now, because America and Canada too is really having to grapple with some hard truths that a lot of us have been saying all along. So I think seeing it presented in such a beautiful, straightforward way is a really useful tool as we all kind of move into this era where everyone is awakening up to things that we've known, our whole existence.
All right. Thank you all for those responses. I want to just ask a couple of other things, and then I want to just really open it up to the audience here to be able to ask your questions to our panelists. Within the context of the film, Robert, you talk about, you were asking one of the people that you were speaking with there about the role of education. And of course, the kind of truth that you want to tell is precisely the kind of truth that so many people and politicians and activists on the other side of the spectrum are trying to ensure don't get told, right? And so you've done a lot of work, it seems to me, with young people and in schools and in the context of education. Just what hopes do you have for this film to be able to accomplish within the sphere of education at a moment when anti-CRT bills are being put forth and other, activist agendas are being enacted to ensure that the truth that you want to tell doesn't get told. Is there something specific about this film, right, and this genre, this medium, that you hope might be able to do some work both inside schools proper and just as a tool of education? That's the first question I want to ask. And then secondly, Bree mentioned about the silos and about Reverend Yearwood's point. And I take that point, and I think it's really significant that the three of you and your particularity, all right, show up in this space with us. Rob is a white man, right? And as an Indigenous woman and as a Black woman together here having this conversation. And I'm curious about the ways in which you see your work overlapping and maybe some of the challenges of trying to break down those silos and do the overlapping work towards the kind of progressive agenda that you'd like to see.
Well, first, I would say that in terms of education and getting the film shown, it's, it will get shown where people reach out and want to show it. And unfortunately, like a lot of the history in this country, that, if a school district or a state or wherever, wants to ignore it or ignore this history, in more generally, apart from the film altogether, there's no way to force it into a curriculum. And so, you, with so many things like this, you put it out there, you hope that people will embrace it because of its, both its urgency and its good intention and its integrity, but, we can't force that to happen. And that's one of the frustrating things about, telling the truth about this history at this moment, and both, the current necessity of it, but also, with a historical perspective, is we need to know that, we need to know who we are and where we've been and why our history has unfolded the way it has, but we can't force it. But on the other hand, in the process of painting these portraits and being involved in these struggles, working with people like Bree and Maulian has been absolutely thrilling for me because, as we have worked together and, unveiled portraits and talked to audiences together, a couple of years ago, we had Bree and Maulian together on stage in Maine. And you actually saw that in the film briefly, that they were together on the stage and touring around Maine and talking to different audiences. I mean, that was in terms of breaking down silos. So we were dealing with them with Indigenous history, African-American history, racial history, economic history, all kinds of things were all being, and I would say in a larger way, cultural history of this country. We were able to do that. And the film and the portraits have been a vehicle for that. But it requires, the willingness of audiences, of communities to reach out and, want to be part of it.
I guess I can jump in. Yes, I mean, I think education, it's so fundamental, it's so essential. I don't think that there is any way towards organizing people and mobilizing people without education. It really is the baseline for everything. And I think that we do ourselves a great disservice if we don't recognize that and if we don't make that a central part of our praxis, right? If we're asking ourselves, how do we really go about changing things, whatever the issue might be, you can't separate education from that. And education is never neutral. I think that's the other thing that's really important to recognize too. And education can either serve a purpose of liberating people, or it can serve a purpose of oppressing people. Another part in the documentary that I thought was really powerful was with you, Maulian, where you were talking about the second wave of genocide, and how the schools were used, became as a way of stripping people of culture and history and identity. And I think a lot of the resistance, in this society in particular, to having accurate historical education is because it would require us to change things in the present. I think if we could teach the full history of this country, not gloss over anything, not any revisionisms, like really teach the history as it was, as it is, and not change anything. It didn't have any implications for the present, people would be fine. The resistance is that, when you have that awareness, that we need to change things. And I think the portion where the historian, I believe, that was in the documentary made the connection between, Columbus and genocide and slavery and climate, and just taking down an entire forest so they can harvest sugarcane. When you learn the history and you are able to apply that to understanding like our current conditions, where we're now at a crisis point on all of these things, and you see that, unless we make a change to the whole way we have organized the economy, the way we are organized socially, the way that we could either truly have self-governance that recognizes the human rights of all people, or we can, descend further into a form of fascism, and how all of those things are connected. When you have that awareness, then you're able to change it. And so the assault and the attack on education is about depriving people of that. And that's why I think I loved how it began with the focus on young people, because, and a lot of the footage as well of Robert speaking to young people, because that is so key. Like there's no way to move anything unless there is a lot of intentionality around education and really having these conversations with young people. As an organizer, that's a lot of where I focus, because that's the only way we can truly shift things, is if we are educating and supporting the leadership that's emerging among younger people.
Absolutely. And I think that, it troubles me that there's this battleground in schools, right? That, we're really filtering or trying to filter the information that very young children can get about very real truths about our country, past, present, and future. So I think that vehicles like this documentary can be so powerful because it's shining this light on a broad set of issues. And I'm thinking about how we talked about the siloing of things. It was so great to share the experience with you, Bree and Rob, because the work of taking down that Confederate flag meant so much to me. I could relate so much to that because I had done a lot of work on Indian mascots and stereotypes and Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. And I think a lot of times people say, well, it's just a flag. It's just a mascot. It's just a picture. Those things can't hurt your feelings. Those things can't change your life. Words don't matter. And they absolutely do matter. Those symbols do matter. Having that flag that represents such traumatic, horrible things, sends signals to a whole population of our country that we don't care about you. You don't matter as much as other people. And that translates to policy. So I think, something that I really appreciate about this effort and us being able to meet was that we are both deeply engaged in a lot of things. And those kind of, stereotypical images and harmful things, we've really been given a great opportunity to talk about why those matter in the everyday lives of people. And that was something else I really appreciated about this project. And what a great springboard for education. Look at these pictures and flags and things that you're used to every day. Here's what they really mean. Here's how they really impact people. And it's not your fault if you didn't know, because, yay, we're here to tell you.
May I add one thing there? I'm just so appreciative of what Bree and Maulian have just said. And one of the ramifications of that is that if you don't, especially at a time like this when changing is so urgent, that if you don't tell kids the truth about who they are and what's happening at this moment, you steal from them their opportunity to actually make the changes that may even save their lives. And so, it's just not just a matter of democracy. It's a matter of, saving human life on this planet. And if we don't tell kids those truths, we really do rob them of their own opportunity to make the changes. I mean, obviously, we see that all over the world, governments, have failed the people because they haven't come to terms with where we really are and what needs to be done. And often it's up to the young people, to insist that these changes be made. And that's why, another reason why this education, their education, is so critical.
Thank you all. What you just said there was so powerful. As a professor and educator, what you just said was, if we don't share, we rob from young people the opportunities to make the changes that might save their own lives. I'm going to be wrestling with that for the rest of the day and well into the rest of my career as an educator, but I appreciate that statement. At this point, I really want to open it up to our audience, and if we have questions, I'll just try to bring the microphone around and allow you all to ask some questions. If you wouldn't mind, just say your name and introduce yourself to them.
Hi, Rob. It's Laura Rothstein. I'm here, of course, and sitting next to Joe Gutman. The film was beautiful. It was so inspiring. Everything about it was fabulous. It inspires me every time I spend time with you. And so Joe and I are already talking about how are we going to get all of my law students, his Central High School kids, and I'm wearing Central High School colors, to see this film, because absolutely young people are who's going to carry this. That's what gives me the inspiration every day. So thank you for this film.
Oh. Well, Laura, I wish I were there with you. It's great to hear from you. I'm glad to know that you're there, and I'm glad to know that Joe's there. And I would love to be there when we show the film to Central High School. That would be terrific. I'm hoping to come to Louisville in the fall sometime, so maybe we could arrange it then.
Other questions? Okay.
Hi, my name is Lori, and my question comes from the field of education. First and foremost, you're all amazing. I think everybody in this room is here for a reason, so we're on your team. I think this is an invitation, although I don't think I'm the one that gets to send it out. So maybe it's a suggestion. I'm a school leader and have worked all over the country and have not yet met a teacher who didn't want their children to thrive. I don't think I have, or at least as a leader, they didn't tell me that. That said, I feel like this has to get into the hands of teachers in training. This has to become part of certification. I come from a land of independent schools, so and that's even a hard nut to crack sometimes. But there is so much working against this and now threatening teachers, and some of them are just too afraid to do the right thing, that I guess I invite you, and you've all can be the example, is if we can raise up our next generation of teachers to know this information and be responsible for transferring it, the children will take it and they will run with it. But there is so much working against it in the field of education right now that I'm glad that there's other folks here, who are in teaching capacity. I will do whatever it takes to help break the wall to get this information in the hands of kids. Because once they have it, they'll do all sorts of things with it. But right now, the roadblocks are being built extraordinarily. So I see you did some really cool things in Maine. I love Blue Hill. Are there some structures, Rob, in Maine that other states from grassroots could and be able to, a model that you started? Because Maine can be pretty I'm babbling now, but you get my essence of what I'm saying. This is 36 years in education of young people, and we just keep running into the same roadblocks.
Yeah, I'll say a word, and then maybe Bree and Maulian want to say something about that. In my experience with young people is, they're fully ready, to do the things they need to do. My experience recently was in a classroom of middle school kids who wanted me to come in and talk to them about where we were in the climate movement. And it was really interesting because the first thing we did was I just asked them to go around the classroom and tell me what they knew already. And these kids, they knew about, parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. They knew about sea level rise. They knew about mass extinctions. They knew about habitat destruction. They knew about, the rising waters and the poles melting, and they knew everything really. And it was really stunning at how much they knew. But it turned out later that they really hadn't been taught this at school so much as they'd just taken it in. And then I asked them, after they told me everything they knew, I asked them to tell me, well, how they felt about it. A very different thing. They went around and every single kid said terrified. And I had brought a bunch of portraits of people that I had painted around environment and climate, activists from those fields. And then I began telling those stories. And I told the stories of Tim DeChristopher, and told the story of Bill McKibben and Lennox Yearwood, and all these people that I painted, Rachel Carson, et cetera. And at the end of telling the stories, we went around the classroom again, and I said, well, how do you feel now? And every one of them said, inspired, hopeful, anxious to be doing something. It completely changed as soon as they were presented with the models of people who had had the courage to act and were causing changes and were standing up and had a program and things they could join and had ideas of solutions, all that kind of stuff. That part of the education is so key here. And so getting those models in front of young people so they don't feel isolated, they don't feel like they're going to have to do this all by themselves, that they're already in an enormous body of knowledge and an accumulation of energy ready to act, and that they can be part of that. That's what should be happening in our schools, that they should be being invited to join in right now in everything that they could possibly do. So, I don't know that I could say any more than what I have already about, how to keep spreading this knowledge and spreading the awareness of these models. But that's what has to be done, because that's what changes immediately the way young people respond to what's possible for their lives.
I was just going to add, I think it's amazing that you brought up educators, because we're actually looking at setting up a screening with educators in North Carolina. And I didn't arrange that. I was just contacted about it, which I was like, yes, absolutely. For the exact reason that you're talking about, because educators need to have this conversation. Educators as a whole are under attack as well as part of the broader attack on education. It's not only, trying to limit what children are exposed to, but also just limiting the ability to teach, or just making the profession of teaching so, unsustainable that it forces people out of the profession. And so I think it's important that teachers also, have this conversation among themselves and talk about how to advocate for themselves and for their students. I think that especially like in this era, in more recent years, as we've had this attack on education, or even, the whole controversy around forcing students back to school without spending money on improving, the facilities and the conditions, a lot of teachers are finding themselves in the positions of being activists, I think a lot of people are finding themselves in the position of being activists in ways that they maybe had not planned or had not previously thought of themselves in those roles. And so I think that, yes, I think that is an important conversation to have as well, because teachers, parents, everyone is going to have to figure out how to really mobilize and advocate on behalf of the children in concert with the children, so that they are not just simply left to the forces that are opposing everything we're talking about. I think that sometimes we make the mistake of kind of like operating by this narrative that everybody's looking for progress and it's just a matter of figuring out how, right? Like sometimes it's kind of like we all want democracy. No, we don't all. And that's the reality. Like we have to be very clear about that. We are not everybody in this society in agreement on that. And if we don't show up, then we leave everything to those oppositional forces. So we have to, I think it's very important. And I think teachers are a major part of that. So I'm glad that we're looking at doing this screening in North Carolina. And I think similar screenings around the country would be great.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one too. So I have two children who are 13 and 15. I'm 8 months pregnant with my third child, all girls. So I've been able to see my older two daughters, lived through a whole lot these past few years, and it's interesting how everything is politicized in their schools. My little one is still in the reservation school here. So it's this very kind of insulated, tight-knit community school. And my older one has started high school now. So she's kind of out in the world experiencing Maine, which is not a very diverse state in any way. So she's taken her experiences in education from our reservation school, and she's out there, navigating this new world for her. And, it used to be just some things were divisive, and now it's all things, I think. Even during the pandemic, both of my kids are coming home saying they're getting shamed by their peers for wearing masks. They're talking about being vaccinated. And it's so interesting to me how humans will take, any issue, even health-based issues, and make it an us against them situation. So I think that the more we can promote truth and healing and kind of knocking down these barriers around, the stigma around what we think about certain things, that's going to help all of us. And it's really going to help our kids because they're absorbing so much more than we realize. And I often think about, I'll be doing this era in a decade plus now, again, with my third child. And what is the world going to look like for her? I think about the long-term effects on my older children. It's a whole lot for our kids to deal with right now. And I really, tip my hats to teachers who are navigating this with them and being a safe space and trying to get them as much knowledge as they can. And I think that, truth tellers all over coming together to promote events and that the energy that we have today is really going to benefit everyone.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you for coming here, being here. My name is Rhonda, and Bree, my question is for you. I'm an activist here in Louisville, and I do a lot of work with the young people. And I have one in particular because he is so frustrated in regards to his peers. They were very active with the uprising of Breonna Taylor, a young black woman who was murdered, and now it's sort of simmered. And to get them to realize to take the next step as far as mobilizing, educating themselves about the history and moving forward. And this one in particular states all the time, Ms. Rhonda, I'm frustrated because they do not want to do more. They are satisfied where he's trying to take it to the next level, and he seems all alone and by himself. And then someone that Dr. McCormick know, a young black male who's very gifted, but his life is on the line and may get the rest of his life in jail because of the act that he committed. I think against the system, but he could have done something differently to save his own life. So, what suggestions have you to buy in to get our young ones who really don't know the history? They all for jumping in if it's a protest to be had in the streets, but not coming back to do the work.
Yeah, no, that is a great question. And that is a common issue, right, that we deal with in organizing. And I think the reality of it is the masses of people that turn up to protest in like those heightened moments of, you know, focus and energy around, it's never going to be that same number of people who show up to do the day in and day out organizing. But the good side or the upside of that is that it doesn't have to be masses of people doing it the day in and day out. So like, for instance, in a lot of the organizing that I'm doing, I feel like I'm doing well if I have like 20 consistent people who are meeting on a weekly basis to strategize, you know, around a particular issue. And we know that when the thing flares again, you're going to have tons of people pouring in. And so we deal with like a constant kind of ebb and flow, or I would even like liken it more to like a fire, right? A fire that never quite goes out. Sometimes it kind of goes down, it's burning kind of like as embers as people are just kind of like organizing and constantly going. And then something happens and the fire grows and you have a lot of people are plugging in. The good thing though, too, is that every time we go through that cycle, you have more people plugged in. There are more people, I guarantee you, who are plugged in and getting active and involved now than there were, you know, before George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And so the key, and it can be frustrating. Like, I mean, you know, I think that frustration is part of what drives us forward. I'm never content with the rate of progress. I'm never satisfied with the way things go. Sometimes I have to really make a practice of pausing to celebrate what measure of victories or things we have gotten, because without that, it can feel really overwhelming. It can feel like we're not doing anything at all. I'll just give you an example. I've been really involved in the housing work, and we really pushed hard to get the eviction moratoriums in place. And that was all around this country, people at the grassroots pushing for that. And we got it for a period of time. A lot of people were, you know, saved in their homes, were prevented from getting evicted. But now those measures have been taken away. And now that crisis has grown even more. And so a lot of the work of organizing is preparing for that next thing that is coming. And then as far as, you know, people who are facing criminalization from what they do, I think that, you know, to whatever extent is possible, like building that steady support around them. You know, if you can have maybe just have a network that is totally just dedicated to supporting that person, because that's a lot of organizing just on its own, is like the legal process of trying to protect them, of trying to make sure that they have what they need, or people sending them notes and words of encouragement, you know. But I would just say, like, you know, despise not the day of small beginnings. And as I'm saying this to you, I'm truly saying this in a heartfelt manner, because it's something that I have to return to again and again, because I do get so frustrated. It's very frustrating when you are showing up every day for something and you are aware of the level of crisis, you know, that it's at. And sometimes people care, but they're just so overwhelmed by so many things. That's part of how oppression operates. We have a lot of people who are impacted by housing who don't have the capacity to show up to organize around the issue, because they're just trying to figure out where they're going to be at the end of the month, you know? And so if you can have a dedicated, I would just focus first on just getting a dedicated group, and don't worry about the size, just worry about the consistency to start with. Look at what you can do with the capacity that you have, because I guarantee you it's coming again. There's going to be, you just got to prep for the next time that all the people come rushing back in, because it's going to happen. And the amount of organizing that you do between those two moments is what's going to determine how successful you are the next time that everybody is focusing in and rushing to the streets.
Let me just put that in a slightly different frame. I mean, I so appreciate what Bree just said. You know, often what we're really talking about here is power, you know, how we're going to attain power. And often the way we have power is being ready to have power. You know, that kind of organizing, maintaining a core group, which will be ready when, as Bree says, the next thing happens, you know, because there's enormous power against solving the problems that need to be solved in this society. Economic power, political power, you know, racial power, all those things are out there. But there are these enormous opportunities that come where where suddenly, something has given people in the society the permission to see their lives differently, to see the structure of power laid bare. And they've got to be ready at those moments. And the kind of organizing that Bree does, or maybe you there speaking in the audience about, these kinds of issues, being ready and being prepared to take hold of that power when it comes is a really important thing.
Yeah, and just quickly, I think resistance can take many forms, and sometimes it's quiet. So not to get too discouraged if you don't feel all the way supported at all times, because sometimes I definitely can relate to the frustrations. And I think sometimes you have to remind yourself that, if people of color are even quietly, being good parents, raising their families, maintaining housing, having their needs met, breaking dysfunctional cycles, healing from trauma, all of that is also resistance against this oppression that has beaten us all down for so long. So, these seeds are planted and they might not spring up right away, but they might be cultivating something that in 10 or 20 years, is very beautiful and very ready for that power that Rob just spoke about.
Other question? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Rob. It's Michelle. What a lot of people here may or may not know is that it's 18 years of work that's gone on in this city, in Louisville, in our school systems with Rob. So we now have a generation of young people who are raising their own children who were taught the stories of the truth tellers. Back in those days, there were 8 of them. So what I was wondering is, because we all understand that, we have a teacher here sitting over here, Cindy Young, who did her national board certification back in the early days of working. So she's got generations of kids out there who understood your story as it existed then. And you did mention that when I met you, you talked about it being therapeutic. And I guess now I'm thinking about John Hunter, who talks about the long now. And I wondered if each of you could speak a little bit about how something begins as something you do for yourself and your own healing, and then pushes into the next space. And where is it going? Where do you see it going now? And maybe this is directed really to Rob, but I would love to hear from the other truth tellers, because you're out there spreading the same message now to young people. What is our long now for our children?
Actually, I'd love to reverse the order here. Maulian, why don't you speak to that first, and then we'll all chime in.
Sure, great question. So for me, I got started on my journey as a teenager because I got really mad about Indian mascots. I saw my peers using them in schools, the fake feathers, fake war paint and everything. And as a teenager, kind of figuring out my place in the world and my identity, to see something that I had taken so much comfort in and something I felt so sacred, like in the core of my being, and that's my culture and my identity as an Indigenous person, to see that being like stolen and mocked and misused, that presented this really hard conflict within myself. And then it forced me to look at all the other stereotypical images in society and all of the other kind of beating down of our people in a very public way, when we're also carrying this historic beating down of our people for generations. So for me, I was really lucky to be mentored by some adults who were able to get me in front of classrooms of my peers who were using these Indian mascots and talking about them, which was sometimes empowering and sometimes terrifying, and was definitely a mixed bag. But over the past couple of decades of doing this work, it really became more meaningful when it was completely outside of myself, when it went from that, like, well, I'm going to release this energy and I'm going to tell people how I feel and I'm going to hope to impact, something that'll make me feel better about this anger and this kind of discomfort in myself. I found the work to be the most fulfilling when it became about my whole community. And then when it became about really everyone, when you work for equity and justice, that benefits the whole. It's great to lift up your own people, but when you're really speaking these truths, you're helping everyone. And, being able to work as a tribal ambassador and pass the law to ban those mascots was such a cool full circle moment, because my daughters were standing in the governor's office with me when the bill was signed. And I got to know that they wouldn't have a fraction of that anger or discomfort about these mascots that I did, because we had made this huge change. So I think sometimes it's a very long now, like you put it, but I really feel that, in those moments where, your emotions are going crazy and you're trying to like parse out a lot of things about your journey, keeping that eye on the prize of this will elevate my people, this will help everyone, and in turn will heal a lot within me as well.
Yeah, I think, the status quo is simply not sustainable. It's just not. Like, there really is a clock that is ticking. I mean, I go back, I think another really impactful point again in that interview with Reverend Yearwood. And I don't know what year that was, Robert, where you were talking to him and he had the cap on that said 10 years. I don't know what year, I don't know how many years we're on now, but I mean, we are in a very real countdown. And I think that, quite frankly, I feel like we are cheating the youth. We are cheating the young people. We are denying them a future by being selfish in our unwillingness to make adjustments that may be somewhat uncomfortable, because we don't want to use less gasoline or, whatever it is. We don't want to have uncomfortable conversations or shift the way that we are used to socializing with each other or being or whatever, or our level of consumption. We just don't want to change anything that will be too much of an inconvenience. We don't even want to wear masks, right? Or anything that's going to be an inconvenience. And we are denying young people a future. We're denying them a chance. And so I think that in terms of the now, I think it's an urgent now. And I think that we have to prioritize the children. Like, I don't think we can talk just in terms of, this year. We're kind of like culturally, I feel kind of caught in this like 24-hour cycle. It's like everything is, and it's because so many things are happening, but we're kind of like just focused on what is happening in the next 24 to 48 hours. And sometimes it's really hard to get people to engage in this discussion of like what we are looking at over the next 20 years if we don't make changes. And a lot of times I think these topics that we're talking about, they get reduced to the culture wars, right? It's kind of, everything is framed as like a culture war. Well, you feel this way and I feel that way. And it's this tension between cultures, instead of acknowledging that there are very real ecological realities that we are confronting. It's not just about how we feel about the climate. There's a reality there. It's not just about how we feel about racism. There's a reality there that we can point to data and science that shows a direct correlation between racism and health outcomes, right? Or between racism and democracy or any other number of things. And so again, I think that education is fundamental. How do you get to action if you don't have information first? You can't act without information. We're fighting for curriculum in the schools, but as that's going on, using all of these other opportunities to engage with young people, wherever we can, and the wider community, to talk about these things so that we are really having a very real understanding of what's happening. The last thing I'll say is that the kind of dangerous thing about what's happening now is people are kind of able to wall themselves off. Like, if I can just surround myself with with things that are going to tell me what I want to hear. And so I think one of the challenges is like, I'm sure if you all are here as wonderful people, it's probably because you're ready to hear the truth, right? So how do we break through the bubbles of the people who are walled off, who are not necessarily going to come out to a screening like this? Because I think there are a lot of people who it's not their inclination to come to it, but if it comes to them, it can shift their understanding of things.
I wanted to add one thing that was connected with both what Bree and Maulian said, and that is, one thing we have to do, and by the way, Michelle, so glad to hear your question and know you're there. We do have this long history of working together, so it's really satisfying to be able to have this conversation with you. But one of the things that we know is so important is not just, teaching the things that kids need to know about their history, is providing means for them to engage in the solutions. Because, one of the things that happens with, if you're angry about an injustice, which is important because you should be angry about injustice, and that all that energy and wrought upness that comes with that, if you're then engaged in creating a justice, the feelings shift from the anger to just love of the people and the issues, and making that change and engaging with the people who are doing it. That shift in energy is absolutely crucial. And that's what carries forward. So much of what happens in our culture around, trying to create more justice depends on the perseverance of people. These things don't get changed, immediately, although we're up against some that need to be changed immediately now. But often it's that willingness to engage and feel surrounded by a community of people loving justice so much that they will continue to act together. And that's what is so important, becomes a piece of our education with young people.
Yes, hi, I'm Cindy Young, and Rob, we came with Michelle to know 18 years ago, and we did a project with the Americans Who Tell the Truth portrait series. And actually, Michelle has done a lovely job with working on some curriculum around the truth tellers. And because I'm retiring this summer, I did it fast and did it just this spring with, I guess a kind of a preliminary test to find local truth tellers with Jefferson County. But I wanted to put that out because, like we've talked about, there's so many different silos, and in education we're also separated, and there is this curriculum that you've put out that I know Michelle's worked on, and that's been used at Central High School, and it's been used at Manual and at my middle school, that we should all kind of maybe connect on. And I just really want to thank all of you for all of your work, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. I think we might have time for these last two questions.
All right, I have a quick one. My name is Hans Peterson. I'm married to Michelle, and I've had a bird's eye view of lots of work with the portraits and Americans Who Tell the Truth here in Louisville. I recently found myself elevated to a leadership position, and so see these portraits and truth-telling is a great lens to bring the work I get to lead my staff through in equity, working with people who work with young children in early care and education, so both the 5 children. And I think, Rob, if you would have any examples you could share of agencies, communities, or organizations who have engaged in ongoing work with the portraits or anything like that, as an example, I like to hear and see what other folks have done in spaces to help drive my ideas for what would work in our space. And and particularly in spaces that may not be a school, it might be a community, it might be an agency, it might be an organization. If you could share anything about that or direct me to where I might go read about that, I think I would appreciate hearing about that for just a few seconds here. Thank you.
Thanks, Hans. I hope you're doing well. I know you've had an operation recently, and I hope you're recovering well. Yeah, that's really an interesting question of, all the different things that are going on. One of the things that's been happening in a number of places, I mean, Louisville is one of them, but a similar kind of thing happened in Asheville, North Carolina, another one in Ipswich, Massachusetts, and in general, it's been happening in Syracuse, where a whole community has gotten involved with the Truth Teller Project, and has not just sort of looked at it from the outside and said, oh, this is something that we could be learning about, and this is just, some people's histories we could be studying and that kind of thing. Instead, they've engaged with it at a much deeper level, where they have used it as just a model of how they could, make their own portraits, write poems, tell stories, create music, write poetry. There's so many things that can be done in response to this project. And it's great to see when a community embraces it in that way, where that they become so engaged that it becomes their project. It's not something that came in from the outside that says, we have something to teach you. It's something that they engage with and then teach themselves about how to use these models to answer the problems in their own community, to create better dialogue in their own community about how they're going to solve problems, to showcase how both adults and young people can work together and be surprised by each other's creativity towards solving those problems. That's what we've been seeing in a number of places. And I think that is the most exciting model that's come out of this project to date. Another one that's happening, actually, I was just in Syracuse last week, and there's Syracuse has this center called the Maxwell School for Citizenship and Public Policy. It's one of the foremost in the country. And in the foyer to that, when you come into the Maxwell School, there's this enormous hall of white granite that is, 50 feet long, 20 feet high. And at the very center of it is the bronze statue of George Washington. And what they're going to do there is select 10 of the portraits and put them on the walls in the rest of that space. Because up to this point, that space was all about the sanctity of George Washington and how he kind of stands alone as a father of this country. Not so much the ghosts that surround George Washington, nor what kind of people have been necessary to complete the vision of George Washington because of his own frailties. So now they're going to put 10 portraits around George Washington and ask people to engage in the dialogue of who are these people in relationship to him? What would they be saying to each other? Why were these other people necessary in response to George Washington? I think that's a wonderful way of engaging with this too, is how do, well, it comes up in the film in a number of ways, but in a sense, how do the portraits speak to the founding ideals and the problems with the ideals, the failures of the ideals, and then the extension and vision of the ideals. And so I would love to see that happen more.
Last question, and then we will wrap up.
I'll make it quick. Thank you. Hello, my name is James Etta, and I'm an educator like most in this room. My area of focus is critical thinking with a particular emphasis on reflection. And so, Robert, you mentioned that in the film, you mentioned white privilege, that you were privileged, and it wasn't until you became aware of that through your reflections, that you understood it a little better. In my experience in training educators and designing curriculums around reflection and critical thinking, there's a lot of resistance, because when you do that deep work of self-examination, all kind of stuff comes up that on the individual level, you might not be prepared for, to journey through, to walk through, to get to a place of healing. I've heard that word mentioned today. So, Robert, my question for you is, how did you arrive at being willing to do that deep self-examination to arrive at the awareness of your privilege?
That's a wonderful question and a huge one. I think, that awareness and the willingness to reflect on it is the work of many, many years for me, which began probably most seriously in high school. I grew up in Cincinnati. I went to an all-white boys' school, and in the mid 60s, early 60s, when the civil rights movement was getting going, I looked around my school. I looked at how we were an all-white school, and I began to think, this doesn't look so good. This is not who we should be. And I began to lobby for integrating the school, which happened my senior year. And I couldn't, I don't think I understood or even thought of the word white privilege at that time, but certainly that's what that school represented. And, getting it integrated was the first thing that I think opened up my mind to the possibility of how one can begin to respond to that. I also, a few years later, my older brother was part of Freedom Summer in Mississippi. And that also became a huge stepping stone for me, because I remember when he came home and I asked him to tell me what was really going on there, his response was, why don't you read James Baldwin? And of course, there's no better teacher anywhere, past or present, than James Baldwin, to help a white person understand white privilege and the way it plays out in our society and the harm that it causes, and the way it continues. So I don't know, and then it just, goes on from there. I mean, I think that this is a long process, but I also think, in answer to your question, that kind of reflection, as you suggested, can be very difficult for people to go through alone. And I think there's got to be, ways in which groups of people, communities of people can discuss this in the open, because it's much easier to come to an understanding of what that privilege is and what it means when you're talking about it with other people, and people are willing to be vulnerable and open to looking at themselves and understanding, how they got to these places, and how they are maintained in those places, and then how those places can be changed. I mean, this is, what you're talking about is absolutely critical, to the future of understanding race and privilege and economic justice in this country. I would also love to hear Bree and Maulian say something about that.
As you're unmuting, we may have time for like a 10-second, just a brief shot response from the two of you, because we have met and exceeded our time, which is the mark of a brilliant and fascinating conversation and film that produced that conversation. But I don't want to rob Maulian or Bree of that opportunity, but I also know that we need to leave, and Dean will be putting us out of the speed theater any second now.
Sure, I'll be less than 10 seconds. I get asked a lot what makes a good ally. And I think that listening to Rob's journey just now, that's exactly what makes a good ally.
Same, you become an accomplice when you recognize that you truly have something at stake, which you do. Again, that goes back to the awareness of realizing that we all have something at stake.
Can you all join me in thanking Robert Shetterly, Bree Newsome Bass, and Maulian Dana for a fantastic conversation this afternoon. We really, really appreciate each of you. You're taking the time to be with us and for the work that each of you do respectively in your community and for all of us together. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you all for being here as well. Thank you for coming out. When this screen goes off, there will be a QR code that comes on the main screen that gives you a link to a survey. If you wouldn't mind just filling out a little bit of that survey just to tell us what you thought about this event, and it'll help us for our future planning with the Ann Braden Institute. Thank you all so much, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Yeah, thank you.